Sylvester Stallone was humiliated by the police in the middle of a restaurant, but they quickly repented, and the turn of events was surprising when Sylvester Stallone parked his Escalade just outside La Fontaine, one of the most elegant restaurants tucked along the quieter end of Sunset Boulevard. The entrance gleamed under warm, golden lights, and the scent of rosemary and seared meat drifted onto the street. Stallone adjusted his worn leather jacket and headed for the entrance, hoping for a quiet meal after a relentless day of meetings and calls. Inside, the restaurant exuded quiet luxury: white tablecloths, polished silverware, and soft jazz curling through the air. As Stallone stepped inside, a ripple of uncomfortable glances followed him. He wasn't wearing the flashy suits some of the regulars adored. Instead, he wore old jeans and boots that had seen better days. His rugged, familiar face was partially hidden under the brim of a simple baseball cap. To some, he didn't look like a guest. He looked like a man who didn't belong. Stallone noticed the shift instantly. The way the hostess stiffened, the sideways glances, the dismissive smirks. He sighed internally. It wasn't the first time he had been misjudged. A thin, sharp-faced maitre d', mid-40s, approached, but didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he glanced Stallone up and down and said, "Can I help you, sir? We have a dress code." His tone was polite on the surface, but soaked with disdain. "I'm just here for dinner," Stallone answered simply, his deep voice even. The maitre d' didn't move, hesitating as if weighing whether to even seat him. "We're quite full tonight," he said, though several tables sat empty in plain view. Stallone just nodded and walked over to the bar, choosing to wait without making a scene. Minutes ticked by. Stallone sat quietly, hands folded, while the waitstaff bustled past him, intentionally ignoring his presence. The room was filled with low conversations, clinking glasses, and the occasional polite laughter, but a few eyes kept flicking toward him, whispers following. That was when two LAPD officers entered the restaurant, their presence loud without saying a word. Officer Travis McCall and Officer Dean Simmons, the kind of cops who thought their badge gave them the right to be judge and jury anywhere they went, surveyed the room like they owned it. Travis's gaze quickly found Stallone. His lip curled into a mocking smile. "Look at this guy," Travis muttered to Dean, loud enough for several diners to hear. "Looks like he got lost looking for a pawn shop." Dean chuckled as they swaggered over to the bar, where Stallone sat silently, still waiting for service. "Hey, buddy," Travis said, clapping a hand none too gently on Stallone's shoulder. "You know you're a little out of place here, right?" The room grew tense. Conversations hushed. Stallone slowly turned his head toward the officer, calm but unmistakably firm. "Just waiting for a table." Dean stepped in, grinning. "Maybe you should be waiting outside." The maitre d' glanced nervously at the scene unfolding, but made no move to intervene. Lisa Graham, the manager, peeked out from the back, her eyes narrowing. Travis, emboldened by the inaction around him, leaned in closer to Stallone. "Why don't you show us some ID, just in case you're here to cause trouble?" The insult hung in the air like a bad smell. Stallone, for a long moment, said nothing. His jaw tightened. His fists curled loosely on the bar counter. He had taken punches harder than these two could imagine. But the disrespect grated on something deep inside him, a lifetime of fighting to be seen for who he truly was. "Sir," Stallone finally said, his voice low but carrying across the room, "I'm not causing trouble. I'm trying to have dinner, unless that's now a crime." Dean snorted again, reaching for his belt, where a pair of handcuffs gleamed under the dim lights. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be." Several patrons gasped softly. Someone fumbled for their phone. The atmosphere in La Fontaine shifted palpably, the air thick with disbelief. Before Dean could reach Stallone, Lisa Graham stormed toward them, voice sharp. "Officers, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Travis gave a tight smile. "Just keeping the place safe, ma'am." Lisa's gaze snapped to Stallone, and recognition dawned instantly. Her jaw slackened slightly before she quickly composed herself. "That man," she said, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet, "is Sylvester Stallone." A beat of silence, heavy and full. Travis blinked. Dean's grin faltered. Stallone slowly stood, towering over both officers, his presence filling the room like a thundercloud. He pulled out his ID, flipping it open so that even the nearest tables could see the name and the unmistakable photo. The room erupted in whispers and a few loud exclamations. "My God, it's Rocky! That's Sylvester Stallone!" "Are they serious?" Lisa folded her arms. "You owe this man an apology. Immediately." Travis looked around, realizing the room was against him. Cameras were already raised. Faces glared at him with open contempt. Dean muttered something under his breath and took a step back, shame flickering across his face. Stallone's voice, low and calm, cut through the chaos. "Maybe next time you'll think before you judge a man by his clothes or his face?" Without another word, Stallone pocketed his wallet, nodded politely at Lisa, and made his way to the door. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Outside, the cool night wrapped around him. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Behind him, in the restaurant, the officers fumbled to recover what little dignity they had left. Stallone didn't look back, because he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The night air felt sharp against Sylvester Stallone's face as he walked away from La Fontaine, the hum of Sunset Boulevard buzzing in his ears like static. His boots struck the pavement in a steady rhythm, the adrenaline from the confrontation still simmering under his skin. He wasn't angry, exactly. He was something deeper, something colder, a sense of tired disappointment mixed with the iron resolve of a man who had been underestimated one too many times. It wasn't about the insult to his fame. Fame was fleeting, and he had never built his life around the approval of strangers. It was about the way people like Travis and Dean wore their authority like a weapon, a license to humiliate anyone they thought didn't fit. As he reached his SUV, he could hear footsteps scrambling behind him. Turning slightly, he saw a handful of diners from the restaurant, phones out, calling his name. "Sly! We got it all on video!" one man shouted breathlessly. Stallone gave a nod of gratitude, but said nothing. This wasn't about creating a scandal. Not yet. By morning, however, the decision wasn't his to make. The video had gone viral overnight, spreading across Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, news sites, captioned brutally, "Rocky harassed by Beverly Hills cops." Cable news anchors debated it over steaming mugs of coffee. Talk radio lines lit up. Everyone, it seemed, had an opinion. Some called it a simple misunderstanding. Others saw it for what it was, profiling, plain and simple. At a Starbucks in West Hollywood, a group of young professionals crowded around a phone screen, shaking their heads. At a retirement home in Pasadena, two veterans muttered angrily into their morning papers. Across Los Angeles, something was stirring. Stallone sat at his kitchen table, In his Spanish-style home overlooking Coldwater Canyon, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand. He hadn't shaved. He hadn't even slept much. His phone buzzed non-stop, messages from friends, agents, even old co-stars. He scrolled through them absently, his mind already racing ahead. He could let it go. He could chalk it up to another day in a broken world. Or he could do something harder, something that mattered. Meanwhile, at the Beverly Hills Police Department, the mood was sour. Travis McCall stormed through the locker room, slamming his palm against a row of metal doors. "It's blown way out of proportion," he muttered, but the hollowness in his voice betrayed him. Dean Simmons, slumped on a bench, shook his head. "You don't get it, man. That wasn't just some random guy. That was Sylvester Stallone. He's a damn legend." Travis scoffed, but a bead of sweat rolled down the side of his face. Word had already come down from the chief's office. There would be an internal review, possibly suspensions, possibly worse. At noon, Stallone's longtime friend and publicist, Michael Lang, arrived at his house, waving a folder thick with media clippings. "You're sitting on a powder keg, Sly," he said, tossing the folder onto the table. "People are mad. People want you to say something." Stallone leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "It's not about me," he said quietly. "It's about everyone who's ever been treated like trash just because they didn't look rich enough or important enough." Lang tapped the table impatiently. "So what's the move? A press conference? A statement?" Stallone stared out the window at the city sprawled below him. "Number. I want to do it my way." The next day, instead of the typical polished PR campaign, Stallone called a meeting at the Wilshire Grand Center, one of the tallest buildings in Los Angeles, inviting community leaders, activists, retired police officers, and veterans. No paparazzi, no screaming headlines. Just people who knew firsthand what it felt like to be marginalized. The conference room filled quickly. An electric hum of anger, hope, and weary determination filled the air. Stallone stood at the front. No script, no podium, just a microphone and a heart full of words that had been bottled up too long. He spoke slowly, his voice rasping with decades of battles, both on screen and off. "This isn't about one bad night or two bad cops," he said, eyes sweeping the room. "This is about the culture that lets good people get judged by the wrong standards. It's about the abuse of power when it's easier to look the other way." Heads nodded, fists clenched. People leaned forward, drawn in by the rawness of his words. "I got lucky," he continued, his voice thickening. "My name got me out of it. But what about the guy who doesn't have a famous face? What about the woman who just wants to eat dinner in peace?" When Stallone finished, the room burst into applause, not the polite clapping of Hollywood galas, but the deep, soul-shaking kind that meant something had cracked open. Reporters outside the building caught wind of the meeting, and soon cameras swarmed the plaza. Stallone stepped outside into the blinding afternoon sun, flanked by community leaders and retired officers who understood that justice wasn't about status. It was about dignity. Back at the Beverly Hills precinct, Travis sat in a windowless room with his supervisor, beads of sweat forming at his temples. The video was playing again on a monitor, every humiliating second, replayed with gut-punching clarity. "You brought this department into disrepute," the captain said coldly. "There will be consequences." Dean, sitting stiffly beside Travis, didn't say a word. His face was pale, haunted. Travis opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. The world had already judged them. That night, Stallone sat in his living room, flipping through news channels. CNN, MSNB, Fox. His name was everywhere. His image, frozen mid-confrontation, flashed across screens from coast to coast. And yet, he felt no satisfaction. It wasn't about vindication. It was about using the moment, the platform he had, to push for something real. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Lisa Graham, the manager from La Fontaine. She texted simply, "Thank you for standing up. You reminded all of us what dignity looks like." Stallone smiled faintly. He thought about the diners who had recorded the incident, about the strangers who had cheered him outside the restaurant, about the young activists now energized by the story. He thought about the millions who had no cameras, no crowd, no famous name to shield them. Those were the ones he was fighting for. Somewhere out there, Travis and Dean would have to live with what they had done. Not just the viral shame, but the deeper, heavier weight of knowing they had shown the world their worst selves. Stallone didn't need to chase revenge. Their own conscience would be a harsher judge than any courtroom. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly as the city buzzed around him. The fight was bigger than one night, one insult, one man. But the fight had started, and Sylvester Stallone, born fighter, wasn't about to back down now. The days that followed were a whirlwind, but Stallone moved through them with the steady, deliberate resolve of a man who understood the long game. The noise from the media didn't distract him. The pundits, arguing on cable news, the hashtags swirling through social media, the think pieces from glossy magazines, they were all just smoke. What mattered were the conversations happening in kitchens, in barber shops, in union halls, and at church potlucks. The real conversations, where people told each other, "Did you hear what they did to Stallone? If it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone." Those were the voices Stallone cared about. So when the city announced an open forum on law enforcement accountability to be held at the Los Angeles Civic Center, Stallone accepted the invitation without hesitation. He didn't come in a suit. He didn't bring a publicist. He wore a simple black button-down shirt, dark jeans, and that same battered leather jacket, the one that now seemed almost symbolic. The auditorium buzzed with tension as he stepped onto the stage. Rows of citizens filled the seats, black, white, Latino, Asian, young and old, their faces open, expectant, tired of being dismissed. Stallone didn't give a speech. He told a story. The story of that night, the humiliations both large and small, the way the air had changed when two men with badges decided he wasn't good enough for the space he occupied. And he told it not as a celebrity, but as a man, as a citizen, demanding something better. His voice didn't rise, didn't preach. It was steady, and that made it all the more powerful. Respect, he said simply, shouldn't be something you have to earn based on the way you dress, or the way you speak, or the name on your driver's license. It should be the default. The crowd rose to their feet when he finished. The applause, a thunderclap that echoed into the marble halls outside. Meanwhile, at the Beverly Hills Police Department, Internal Affairs had concluded its investigation. The verdict was damning. Travis McCall and Dean Simmons were found to have violated department policy, engaged in conduct unbecoming of an officer, and brought disrepute to the department and the city. In a quiet, tense hearing closed to the public, the chief addressed them directly. His voice was heavy with restrained fury. "You did not just humiliate yourselves," he said. You humiliated every man and woman who wears this badge with honor. Travis, who once strutted through the world with careless arrogance, now sat hunched, eyes dull. Dean looked worse, haunted, gaunt, a man crumbling under the weight of regret. The punishment was swift. Both were suspended, without pay, for 6 months, ordered to undergo intensive training on civil rights, and required to complete 200 hours of community service with organizations dedicated to fighting racial profiling and social injustice. It wasn't enough to erase what they had done, but it was a beginning. The press conference announcing the disciplinary action was packed. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed. The chief made it clear that the department would be undergoing broader reforms, starting with mandatory training on unconscious bias and de-escalation. "This incident," he said grimly, "will not define us, but how we respond to it will." Stallone watched the press conference from the back of the room, unannounced, unnoticed except by a few who dared a second glance. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a reminder that the city had been watching, and that it wouldn't stop watching. Later that evening, Stallone met with Lisa Graham, the restaurant manager who had bravely stepped in that night. They sat at a quiet booth in a small diner off Melrose, the kind of place with cracked vinyl seats and perfect cherry pie. Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she stirred her coffee. "I should have spoken up sooner," she confessed. "I froze. I let it happen until it got too far." Stallone shook his head gently. "You found your courage. That's what matters. Most people never even get that far." He paused, studying her face. "You reminded everyone in that room that decency isn't about titles or uniforms. It's about choices." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that maybe she hadn't failed. Over the following months, the ripple effect from that night continued to grow. Stallone's story sparked town halls in other cities, led to new community outreach programs between police and residents, inspired documentaries and op-eds, and even curriculum changes in local colleges. A foundation was created, the Guardian Project, dedicated to promoting dignity and fairness in law enforcement interactions, funded in part by anonymous donations, though everyone suspected Stallone had a hand in it. He never confirmed it. He didn't need the credit. The work was what mattered. One afternoon, as the spring sun lit up the streets of L.A., Stallone visited a high school in Compton, where a civic engagement program had launched partly because of his story. In the gymnasium, packed with teenagers, in worn sneakers and hopeful eyes, he told them the truth. Change isn't a straight line. It's messy. It's slow. But it starts with refusing to accept that the way things are is the way they have to be. He stayed for hours afterward, shaking hands, listening to stories, posing for photos he didn't even realize would go viral again, this time for the right reasons. Somewhere deep down, he thought about how easy it would have been to walk away after that night, to let pride take over, to sue, to rage. But he hadn't. He had chosen to build instead of burn. And that made all the difference. Months later, as the Guardian Project held its first annual gala, Stallone stood quietly at the back of the ballroom, sipping club soda, watching as families, police officers, activists, and city officials mingled, not as enemies, but as partners. Lisa Graham was there, smiling more easily now. Dean Simmons was there too, having resigned from the force and now volunteering full-time for the foundation. Travis McCall wasn't. Last Stallone heard, he had moved away, seeking to rebuild a life elsewhere. Stallone didn't begrudge him that. Change had to be chosen. It couldn't be forced. As the lights dimmed and the first speaker took the stage, Stallone allowed himself a rare private smile. This, he thought, wasn't about being a movie star, or a headline, or even a symbol. It was about something quieter, something stronger. It was about remembering that the fight for respect, for fairness, for decency, wasn't a Hollywood story. It was real life, and it was worth every punch, every scar, every step. Outside, the night air was cool and sweet. As Stallone slipped out of the ballroom and into the waiting car, he glanced up once at the stars glimmering above the city skyline. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. He would be ready, always.